Hello there, and welcome back to Atland Insights, where we talk about the Swedish Atlantis theory from the late 17th century from a man called Olof Rudbeck, whose work was called Atland or Manheim, written between 1672 and 1702, with basically the central argument that the Indo-Europeans have Scandinavia as their homeland, that they are much more connected than today believed, and that they all come from Scandinavia in the beginning. And it is Plato's account that we are discussing right now, because this is, of course, a central theme in the work, being that it is included in the title. This is what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, the Ionians and their possible connection to this whole Scandinavian, Atlantean, Hyperborean theory in their mythology. That will explain why Rudbeck uses the Ionian stadion instead of the normal stadion usually used. Since the Ionian stadion and the Swedish foot, they are based on the same foot. The Ionian foot and the Swedish foot is the same, which is ostensibly why Rudbeck uses the Ionian one. If they are also from this Atlantean or Scandinavian or Hyperborean or whatever, if this connection is true. And then we will begin talking about the subject of today, which is that of the size of Atlantis. And we will see how actually the first reading you should do of Plato is that of simply height, adding the 2,000 and 3,000 stadia, adding from top to under. And we will see some problems in application with this to specifically the area of Scandinavia. But we will also see some interesting tidbits about this 5,000 stadia measurement and how it is applied and used. And then we will finish off by talking about the graves around the plain, which are 10,000 stadia, which makes it seem like this ought not to be around the plain in the capital, but instead on either side of the island, right? On either side of its height. So let's begin by talking about the Ionians and their supposed connection to this whole Atlantic, Hyperborean, Scandinavian theory in their mythology. So a stadion, as we said, is an ancient Greek measurement, which is its exact measurement is today highly debated. But we know that it's supposed to be 600 feet. But what 600 feet is has varied a lot through history, even in Greece. So that is why it's highly debated. The conventional way to define a stadion is that of 185 meters, while Rudbeck uses instead the Ionian foot of 29.6 centimeters, which is the same as the Swedish one. And it gives you a little bit shorter stadion of 177.6 meters instead. So this has smaller bearing on the larger measurements of the whole island at large. It only gives a difference of a few miles over several thousand stadia. But when you look at the smaller measurements in the capital and so forth, that's when this definition of a stadion becomes more important. I'm just going to show you what I've found about the Ionians and how they might be connected to this whole theory. So the Ionians are said to come from the forefather of Ion in their mythology, who was the son of the Hyperborean Apollo. So the Ionians would be Hyperborean in origin. And in Rudbeck's opinion, Apollo is the Nordic god Baldur, under the other name of Habal, High Baal. And Habal became Apollo in Greek, according to Rudbeck. So this Habal is in the same line as the interpretation he makes of the Hyperborean sage Abaris, which he says is Haborne, which means highborn, which is in line with what he believes the Hyperboreans were, which were highborn or overborn, in Swedish Iverborne, which is a title you can find in a few documents. It's not well documented, but it exists. And Rudbeck believes that Überborne became in Greek Hyperborean. He believes that hyper is a Greekification of the Swedish word Iver, which means över, over. Y and Ö is a common vowel shift that happened in ancient times in Scandinavia. Another interesting tidbit is that the Ionian settlement in Crete was called Candia, where the Wikipedia page even says that this is the trail, where the trail of the Ionians begin. So this is, of course, very similar to the word Scandia. Opening up the question, is this connected? This, of course, in itself proves nothing, but this is just to open up the questioning. We have the big biblical name of Javan, which is a personification of the Ionians, according to most biblical scholars. And he was a son of Japheth. So he was among the Japhethites, which was a word commonly used for all the sons of Japheth. And they are basically like the Indo-Europeans. So they are Indo-Europeans, according to mythology, or in the Bible. We have Japhethites, which is a Greek titan, who is kind of like a father figure, including a father of Atlas. And that is, of course, very reminiscent of Japheth in the Bible, both in character and in name. Why a lot of learned, especially in older times, right, a few hundred years ago, they quite often connected Japhethites with Japheth, saying that they are one and the same. And I actually find that quite likely as well. So I believe that Japheth is the father of Atlas, since I believe Japheth is Japhethites, thereby the Ionians being a son of Noah, also being an offspring of these Atlanteans. And with Rudbeck's reasoning, since he believes that Atlantis is Scandinavia, the counterpart in the Norse mythology would be our forefather of the gods, which is the Allfather, Odin, which he reconstructs in a kind of proto-form as Atin, combining all the Atlantic and international sources. For example, the Dying and the Rising Gods, Attis and Adonis, to reconstruct this Atin, which later became Odin. In Japhethites' family line, or Japheth, if you want to connect these two, in his family line is Hyperion, or Hyper-Ion. So here again, you have the Ion, which is the forefather of the Ionians, who is said to come from Hyperborea, right? So Hyperion, he drowned in the Eridanus River on Atlantis, according to Diodorus Siculus, which is very reminiscent of the Phaeton story, where he was drowned in the Eridanus River. And I will do a separate video on this Phaeton story, which is the Hyperion story. I will show some very good indications that this might be Scandinavia that is being talked about in this myth. In Edda, we have the king John Aker, or Ion Aker, which in Rudbeck's opinion is the Greek mythological figure of Inachus, whose daughter Io was turned into a white cow. So John, Io, Inachus. There's a lot of Io and John symbology going on here. As you can see, it's kind of a theme. In Rudbeck's opinion, the cow is the earth from the Audumbla in the Edda, and its whiteness is simply because of the snow landing on top of the earth. And this is part of the section on the earth and sun worship, and its specific Scandinavian nature, even in the countries far from it, even down to Egypt, according to Rudbeck. So this would be a whole section on its own, a whole series on its own. Here I will just show one interesting tidbit, which is directly connected to the Ionians. And this is from a source called, or from a man called Diogenes Laertios, who wrote that Archelaus, 450 BC, had brought knowledge from Ionia to Athens. He described how the earth came to be And he said that water is melted by heat and produces, on the one hand, earth. So they said that water is melted by heat. They heard of ice melting but had no conception of it. So they wrote that water melts instead, indicating that this mythology comes from far north. The Edda strongly emphasizes ice melting and bringing forth life in Ginnungagap, and there earth is created. Ginnungagap, that turns towards the south, was filled with thick and heavy ice and rime. When the heated blasts from Muspelheim met the rime, so that it melted into drops, then, by the might of him who sent the heat, the drops quickened into life and took the likeness of a man, who got the name Ymer. And Ymer is earth. They took the body of Ymer, carried it into the midst of Ginnungagap, and made of him the earth. Of his blood they made the seas and lakes, of his flesh the earth, but of his bones the rocks. Of his teeth and jaws, and of the bones that were broken, they made the stones and pebbles. So here is a quick questioning. Are the Ionians Hyperboreans or Atlanteans? And in Rudbeck's framework, therefore, Scandinavians, Goths and Scythians. Is this why the Ionian and Scandinavian foot is the same? Is this reason to use the Ionian stadion? My area of expertise is not even Rudbeck. I'm not an expert in this either, but I'm certainly not in Greek history. So I leave the viability of using the Ionian stadion in this way to those who are expert in Greece. This is just my interpretation from knowledge of Rudbeck's work, why this could maybe be the case if you use the mythological lens. And just to answer one question some of you might have, that how can Scandinavia even conceivably be Atlantis, because Scandinavia is not an island? Well, it's conceivable if you just see how they viewed Scandinavia in antiquity, because most viewed it as an island. We have, of course, Jordanes, which is the most famous Gothicist source, which says that the Goths and the Scythians come from the Arctic island of Skansa. We have Pliny, who said that the Caudanian, which is the Gulf of Bothnia, is filled with islands, so to speak, he says, and that the most famous among those is that of Scandinavia. We have Pomponius Mela, who in the 1st century puts in the Caudanian Sea many islands. It's filled with islands, so to speak. We have Ptolemy, who made the work Geographica in the same time. He also renders it as a small island. We went over this map in, was it the 2nd video? Where we explained how all the place names he still knew about, of course, when he read about them. He just severely misunderstood how they should be rendered on the map and drew everything out into the east, into Asia. Why the map became eastwardly exaggerated, because so many place names and things got placed in Asia. So let us begin talking about the size of Atlantis. In Rudbeck's opinion, the correct way to interpret this is that it is supposed to be 5,000 stadia in height, and that its width is not even mentioned. And I will get to why the width is not even mentioned in a bit. We will do some problematization with this theory, at least in application to the Scandinavian area specifically. But we'll also pose some interesting questions regarding this 5,000 length, how it is applied and used, and not used, and so forth. So Rudbeck writes in Book 1, page 94, he paraphrases Plato in Critias, that the whole island was above its capital, 3,000 stadia, and down to the sea, 2,000. In other words, he says that the island is 5,000 stadia in height. And there are multiple ways to interpret this 2,000 times 3,000 stadia. The most common one, the most popular one to use today, is that it is the size of the plane, which makes the island considerably larger than this, then it almost immediately becomes of this continental proportion, which we've argued is not viable. Another interpretation is that it is the size of the island, which would be, this is still viable, right? This 2000 times 3000 is the proportions of an island. And then you have Rudbeck's interpretation of its length. So this is the modern translation, and it uses the measurements of it being the plane. So if you read, it goes, and this plane had a level surface and was as a whole rectangular in shape. This plane, that is, being 3000 stadia long on either side and 2000 stadia wide at its center, reckoning upwards from the sea. So how did he come to this interpretation? Let's look at a word-for-word translation. So I use the Perseus library and their translations of the words, and then the translating machine called Polytranslate, which is a machine for ancient languages. Definitely the best translator for ancient languages, including ancient Greek. And then I compare it with ChatGPT, which is actually surprisingly, this is one of the things that ChatGPT is actually quite good at, in my opinion. Doing these word-for-word translations. It's quite often pretty correct. So I use it just as a small confirmation in the tail end. So here it's talking about the plane, that it is smooth and level even, smooth and even, but the whole is prolonged, elongated, or prominent, standing out, projecting. So here it's primarily indicated that it is supposed to be a change of subject, not and. This is a secondary meaning of the word. But the primary meaning is but. So here you should change subject. Here we're now in the all, the whole island. On, upon, upwards, on the one hand. So on one hand, on the overside, it is 3000 stadia. And downwards, down, this is probably downwards. But downwards, from the middle, upwards from the sea, 2000. So plane, and then we shift to the whole island. On the top side, 3000, and down from the middle, upwards from the sea, 2000. If we just do a literal rendering of this, the plane was smooth and even, but the whole was elongated. The top side was 3000 stadia, but downwards from the middle 2000, reckoning upwards from the sea. And again, when we look at Rudbeck's interpretation, he says that the whole island was above its capital, 3000, and down to the sea, 2000. So you can say that Rudbeck made a literal translation. Or maybe this is just what Plato meant. So the key word here is this word, which means primarily but, and secondarily it means and. And the modern versions, or if you want this to be the plane, you have to use the secondary meaning and to continue talking about the plane, right? And this is what the modern versions do. And was as a whole rectangular in shape. But if you use this primary meaning of but, it becomes but the whole was rectangular. So here we have shifted focus, making the whole the island. And this actually makes a lot of sense in the context because this section is about the island at large, right? He begins talking about the island and then comes to the plane and then shifts back to the whole island here. So it is actually quite clear that he actually means this as the island as a whole and describes the top side and the other underside, meaning that he only describes height. It is 2000 to the south, 3000 to the north, meaning that it is closer to the south, right? Which is why he immediately after states that, and this region all along the island faces towards the south. So why does he only describe height? I described this problem that ancient geographers had in my video on the Ptolemaic map. I will link it here. This problem is why Ptolemy's map was so elongated or extended along this axis. It's because this axis is very uncertain in ancient times. There was no easily observable natural phenomena which you could report which determined your longitude. It was never reported, so it was never known. But the latitude you can easily observe via the longest day of the year, the amount of sun hours. It is easily observable, and the amount of sun hours you have determines your latitude. It was often reported in the texts and in mythology and so forth, why this was often known, right? But this one, there's no easily observable natural phenomena naked to the eye. Why this was a much more complicated matter, determining this axis. So here is the problem I have with this theory, applying it to specifically Scandinavia, other than that it is a peninsula, as we said. In the ancient times, they conceptualized Scandinavia as an island. But Rudbeck, he defines 5,000 stadia as 1 degree, and therefore Atlantis has 10 degrees in height, if Atlantis is 5,000 stadia in height, right? And it does this because Scandinavia, the peninsula, is 10 degrees in height. From Malmö to Tornio, if this is the peninsula, it is 10 degrees. The problem, or I will get to the problem in just a few seconds. So he defines a stadia as 300 Swedish L. 1 L is 59.4 centimeters. And this gives you 178 meters. Almost the same as used in Alkarp, which is a very good book on Rudbeck. This is all very confusing and conflicting, but I use the 178.2 since this is 300 Swedish L. And if you multiply this with 5,000, you get that 1 degree is 89 kilometers, making the circumference of the Earth 32,000 kilometers. And this is way too small, even for his time. There are several different theories in his time, but it correlates with none of them. So I don't know how he has come to this conclusion that 500 stadia is 1 degree. And it doesn't even correlate with any theory of his time either, that I found at least yet. This is still a problem that I'm trying to see how he has come to this conclusion. I just can't see it at this point. What I can say is that it is basically a little bit too short with our modern understanding of the Earth's circumference. We define 1 degree as 111 kilometers, and with 10 degrees it becomes 1,100 kilometers. This is the length of the Scandinavian peninsula. And 5,000 stadia, give or take, is this long. So it's actually quite too short. But the interesting thing is, either way, that this is pretty much the same distance as Asia Minor, which Plato compared Atlantis to. So this is a little bit smaller, or the same size as Atlantis. And Libya is this size, also about 9 degrees. And I showed in my last video why these two areas are the correct areas of Asia and Libya. I will have that linked here as well. So one interesting thing about this height of Atlantis being 5,000 stadia, even though it seemingly it's very difficult to define this as being Scandinavia in any type of way. This length of 5,000 stadia was used by Eratosthenes when he defined the circumference of the Earth. he used the base of 5,000 stadia, basically the length of Egypt, which is right by Libya, right? So this is just an interesting tidbit. I continue talking a little bit about Ogygia, because in Homer, he says that Ogygia is the island of Atlas, or the daughter of Atlas, meaning that this could be Atlantis, just another name for it. And in it, it says that it is 5,000 stadia from the continent. Again, the length of Atlantis. And what is weird about this is that Rudbeck, he has a completely different measurement. He says that Plutarch says that the continent which encircles the Great Sea is not far from these other 3 islands, but from Ogygia it is 600 stadia, not 5,000, over which you have to use good ships. So this 5,000 stadia and 600 stadia, we will soon here see that this 600 stadia is also missing in another source as well. Or Rudbeck has at least used 600 instead of 5,000. You could ask, is Rudbeck up to some falsification here? What I can say is that he is not known for directly falsifying stuff. So it's more likely that there are versions of this text where this is included. This 600 stadia that Rudbeck uses, he says that this is the distance from Ogygia to the mainland, if it's Scandinavia, because then it is from Scandinavia or from Sweden to Denmark, which is the mainland. It is about 600 stadia. Continuing, we talked about the mistaken mouth of the Caspian Sea when talking about the Ptolemy map. Rudbeck's opinion that the White Sea was once called the Caspian, and it was then a bay of Bothnia, or the Scythian Sea, actually as late as the time of Christ, and that this led learned to believe that the later Caspian down here was also a bay. And I will explain this theory in full when we delve into Ogygia for real, as it is most pertinent to that topic. Now, I will just show one evidence Rudbeck proposes for this being the case, that the Caspian is a bay of the Baltic in ancient times. That is from Strabon in 11.61. And I begin with Rudbeck's reading of this passage. It is quite different from the normal translations. We will do a comparison. So Rudbeck writes, or reads it as, the Caspian Sea is also called the Hyrcanum, and is a bay of the large northern sea, jutting towards the south, which at first is narrow, but widens to 600 stadia. The entrance to the inner part is somewhat longer, and then goes into the empty lands. Then he describes the size of the Caspian Sea as a few thousand stadia, as can be read. So this is what Rudbeck says about Strabon's passage. Now let's compare it to the modern version of Hamilton and Falconer in the Bell edition. This is the same passage, but reading in a modern version. The second portion begins at the Caspian Sea, at which the first portion ends. The same sea is also called Hyrcanian. But I must first describe the sea and the tribes which live about it. This sea is the Gulf, which extends from the ocean towards the south. So the Northern Ocean in Rudbeck is just the ocean here, but it faces southward from the Caspian. It is rather narrow at its entrance, but widens out as it advances inland, and especially in the region of its recess, where its width is approximately 5,000 stadia. So here you have precisely 5,000 stadia, or the length of Atlantis, and this 600 stadia missing, just as in Ogygia, right, where the instead of 5,000 stadia, Rudbeck uses 600 stadia. Here it is the exact same, that instead of 5,000 stadia, Rudbeck uses 600 stadia. Here are the main differences in the readings. Rudbeck says that the Caspian is a bay of the Northern Ocean, while the normal version just states ocean, which I believe is actually more correct. This is just an interpretative layer that Rudbeck makes from his own belief. Rudbeck writes that it is narrow and then it widens to 600 stadia. So this would be the distance between Sweden and Denmark, this area, while the modern version just states that it narrows and then widens and leaves out this 600 stadia remark. And then it says, Rudbeck says that Strabon says that the size of the Caspian is a few thousand stadia, while the modern version is more specific than that actually, and says 5,000 stadia. But they have the 5,000 stadia as the width of the Caspian, which is of course not viable. Even the length of the Caspian, even if you use the modern Caspian, is not nearly 5,000 stadia, especially not the width. Far from it. So how do we solve this problem that Rudbeck reads 600 stadia while it does not exist in the modern versions? And how do you know which interpretation is correct? This 600 stadia, I can say immediately that I've looked in critical editions, which is like books where variations between manuscripts and ways to interpret passages and so forth are discussed. And I found this good websites for editions of Strabo. I haven't found in their editions any mention of a 600 stadia. That could be because this is not viewed as important. A variation or addition not being included, here the 600 stadia measurement, does not mean that they do not exist. There are almost an endless amount of things to analyze and interpret and so forth. There are just an immense amount of texts, right? While you have to prioritize a lot when you do these kinds of things. Even just writing if half of Strabon's work can be a lifetime of work. Many of the critical editions are not even finished because it is so immense, right? There's so much to do. And this may very well just have not been deemed to be of vital importance. It seems important to this theory because it tries to prove something, but to them it was just a number among a myriad of numbers, which if you want to look for variance between them and so forth, you have to look in manuscripts, and this is very time consuming. It is time consuming for me as well, so this will be a project in the future. I hope that I'm sometime in the future will find the manuscripts that Rudbeck used where this 600 stadia is found and see how far back I can trace it. I don't think I can trace it all the way back since none of the critical editions have it included as the oldest manuscripts, but that could of course be because of you also have to look at the methodology they used, why they excluded some things and so forth. So yeah, this is still very much an open-ended question, this 600 stadia. But it is important for this theory, that is, it is Scandinavia, Ogygia and Atlantis. So let's look at this Strabon passage. Here I've used Polytranslate, which I said is the best translator engine for ancient texts. So this is what Polytranslate translates it as. And the bay is holding from the ocean towards the south. So the Caspian comes from an ocean which is south of the Caspian. At the beginning of this ocean, it is sufficiently narrow. This would then ostensibly be between Sweden and Denmark, this part, where Rudbeck has it as 600 stadia. But as it goes inward, it widens, especially at the most inner part, for about 5,000 stadia. So the inner part would be to the east of Sweden, inland, right? And that would continue for 5,000 stadia. So if 5,000 stadia in some way can be interpreted as being Scandinavia, this would make a lot of sense. And here you have a word-for-word translation if you want to make up your own mind of what this passage says. This is the rendering I've come to, that it says, the bay comes from the ocean towards the south, which down in the beginning is narrow. But further inland it widens, and especially where it continues along the inner part, for about 5,000 stadia. I do not believe that it says that the Caspian is 5,000 stadia in width. That just doesn't make sense. In Ogygia, it says that it is 5,000 stadia from the mainland. Rudbeck has it as 600 stadia. It would actually make much more sense for it to be 600 stadia than 5,000 stadia, considering that Plutarch writes that the mainland raise their great bars and shelves that choke up the river and render it hardly navigable. So bars and shelves, this is a peninsula, right? And chokes up the river. The sea is described as a river. Would that make sense if the sea was 5,000 stadia wide? I mean, clearly not, right? The 600 does make a lot more sense, actually, if this is a real manuscript, that is. As I said, I haven't found anything yet. It is quite difficult and hard to find and time-consuming and so forth, but this is a long-term project of mine, to find these connections, or lack of connection, of course. So what is interesting about the Baltic Sea is that, first of all, it is a full of great bars and shelves, which is what makes this area the most island-filled part of the world. I mean, by far, it's not even close, Scandinavia. And therefore it is described as a myriad of rivers. Pliny, he mentions the Gulf Kylipenes in Balticum, and Rudbeck has it as Kyli, meaning gyllene, which means golden, and penis is the Swedish word fene, an old Swedish word, which means marsh or river. So this would be the golden marsh or golden river. Eridanus, the famous Greek river, Rudbeck believes also is from this area, basing it on the Phaeton story, where amber is very prominent. So he renders it as being ör. Rudbeck believes that is the Swedish ö. The Swedish ö became The best example of that being the Gete, being in Swedish götar. Göt became get in Greek. So Eridan became Öridan. Ör being golden, and dan being the Swedish word for tannes, or river. So Eridanus is Öredan, or the golden river, just as the golden river here. And Plutarch describes a river between mainland and Ogygia. Rudbeck has it as 600 stadia. In modern versions it is 5,000 stadia, the length of Atlantis. And it seems like the 600 stadia and the 5,000 stadia are maybe somewhat interchangeable, is my theory at least, that these two has been interchanged in some kind of way. That is what I want to explore. This 600 and 5,000 stadia measurements, being two measurements of the Baltic Sea, is a theory of mine. So there's also Aeschylus in Prometheus Bound, who writes that among the fantastical creatures at Io, here again you have the Ionians, among the fantastical creatures Io was to avoid were the one-eyed Arimaspians, who we've seen in Finland by the Riphaen Mountains. I will link it. By them was Pluto's Golden River, again, So this would then be the Gulf of Bothnia with this reasoning. You also have Pomponius Mela, who writes that the huge Codanus Bay, which is the Baltic Sea, is filled with big and small islands. For this reason, where the sea is received within the fold of the bay, it never lies wide open and never really looks like a sea, but is sprinkled around, rambling and scattered like rivers, with water flowing in every direction and crossing many times. Where the sea comes into contact with the mainland, the sea is contacted by the banks of islands, banks that are not far offshore and that are virtually equidistant everywhere. There the sea runs a narrow course, like a strait. Then curving, it promptly adapts to a long row of land. So he describes the Baltic Sea as a myriad of rivers. And this is the archipelago of Scandinavia, which promptly gets us to the last point, that the graves around the plain, which Plato describes as 10,000 stadia in length, ought then of course to be the lengths on either side of the island of 5,000 stadia in height on either side. So this should of course then be reinterpreted as not around the plain, but as around the island. So this is what he writes. He basically writes that the archipelago was handmade. So this is a mythological explanation, like a creation myth of Atlantis, right? Explaining how the lands were made. And this is mythological in nature, according to Rudbeck. So here I'm just showing that it is supposed to be 10,000 stadia, because it can be a little bit confusing that it just says 10 states. But it should be 10,000 states. 10,000 stadia. So Rudbeck believes that this is reflected in the Edda in chapter 1, Gefjun's plowing, where oxen plow up the land, creating Denmark, and the largest lake in Sweden, Mälaren, which is in the middle of Sweden. Them creating the archipelago is an interpreted layer from the fact that the oxen tore up the land, it says, and drew westward into the sea. From that, Rudbeck draws the conclusion that these oxen therefore made the archipelago as well, when they tore up the lands out in the sea. And this would actually make sense since, as I said, the Scandinavian area is the most filled with islands by far. As you can see here, these combined is 13 times more than even Canada, right? Even though Canada is much larger in size. So if you do a ratio of islands per shoreline kilometer, Scandinavia has 30 times more islands than even the second place of Canada. So this is by far the most archipelago-filled or island-filled part of the world. Why it would make sense that there would be mythologies around the archipelago. And this is also why the Scandinavian area is so misinterpreted as filled with islands, right? Because it is true in a descriptive sense. But since they did not visit these places physically, these geographers, they just heard about it. They heard that this place was filled with islands. Since it is filled with islands, it's just that it is part of the mainland, not just literally filled with islands. This was misinterpreted. So, yeah, this is all I had for today. Some interesting conclusions and a myriad of further questions, which I hope we will see in the future. So, thank you so much, and I hope to. I'll see you soon.